with my read aloud series from Indian Economic Development textbook for class 11. I'm doing chapter 9. I'm doing chapter 10, sorry. Comparative development experiences of India and its neighbors, and neighbors being Pakistan and China. Unit 4, Development Experience of India, a comparison with neighbors. So in this, I finished reading the introduction. I started with developmental path, snapshot view, and in that I finished China. I'm going to read Pakistan now. Pakistan. While looking at various economic policies that Pakistan adopted, you will notice many similarities with India. Pakistan also follows the mixed economy model where coexistence of public and private sectors. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Pakistan introduced a variety of regulated policy framework for import substitution, industrialization. The policy combined tariff protection for manufacturing of consumer goods together with direct import controls on competing imports. The introduction of Green Revolution led to mechanization and increase in public investment in infrastructure in selected areas, which finally led to a rise in the production of food grains. This changed the agrarian structure dramatically. In the 1970s, nationalization of capital goods industries took place. Pakistan then shifted its policy orientation in the late 1970s and 1980s when the major thrust areas were denationalization and encouragement to private sector. During this period, Pakistan also received financial support from Western nations and remittances from continuously increasing outflow of emigrants to the Middle East. This helped the country in stimulating economic growth. The then government also offered incentives to the private sector. All this created a conducive climate for new investments. In 1988, reforms were initiated in the country. Having studied a brief outline of the developmental strategies of China and Pakistan, let us now compare some of the developmental indicators of India, China, and Pakistan. So here we go with demographic indicators. If we look at the global population, out of every 6 persons living in this world, one is an Indian and another Chinese. We shall compare some demographic indicators of India, China, and Pakistan. The population of Pakistan is very small and accounts for roughly about 1/10 of China or India. Though China is the largest nation and geographically occupies the largest area among the three nations, its density is the lowest that we can see in the table. It shows the population growth as being highest in Pakistan, followed by India and China. Scholars point out the one-child norm introduced in China in the late 1970s as a major reason for low population growth. They also state that this measure led to a decline in the sex ratio, the proportion of females per thousand males. However, from the table, you will notice that the sex ratio is low and biased against females in all the three countries. Scholar cites son preference prevailing in all three countries as a reason. In recent times, all the three countries are adopting various measures to improve the situation. One-child norm and the resultant arrest in the growth of population also have other implications. For instance, after a few decades in China, there will be more elderly people in proportion to young people. This will force China to take steps to provide social security measures with fewer workers. The fertility rate is also low in China and very high in Pakistan. Urbanization is high in both Pakistan and China, and with India having 28% of its people living in urban areas. This is table number 1, select demographic indicators 2012. Now, what is demographic? It is different areas or different aspects of human population. For example, what is the estimated population, then what is the annual growth rate of population, what's the density per square kilometers, what's the sex ratio, that is out of 1,000 persons, how many males, how many women, fertility rate in a country, and then urbanization. So all these aspects you will learn in demographic indicators. So, looking at this table, you find that India is estimate it's of 2012. The estimated population in million was 1237 million, China 1350 million, and Pakistan 179. And the source is World Development Indicators, and from this particular app, www.worldbank.org. Now, annual growth of population is 1.26 in India. It was 0.49 in China, and 1.68 in Pakistan, very high. Density is the highest in India, 411 that per square kilometers. That is, just imagine 400 people per square kilometers, and it is China. It is 144, which is quite less. Pakistan, it's 229. Then sex ratio, that is out of 1,000 persons, is 48.3, 48.2, 48.6, and fertility rate is again very high in Pakistan, 3.3, followed by India 2.6, and then 1.6 China. Then you have urbanization. Highest is in China, 52%, India followed by Pakistan 37, and then India 32. So next subheading is gross domestic product and sectors. One of the much talked of issues around the world about China is its growth of gross domestic product, GDP. China has the second largest GDP, PPP of $11 trillion, whereas India's GDP is $4.1 trillion, and Pakistan GDP is $0.45 trillion, roughly about 10% of India's GDP. When many developed countries were finding it difficult to maintain a growth rate of even 5%, China was able to maintain near double-digit growth for more than 2 decades, as can be seen from the table 10.2. We'll just do the table. Also notice that in 1980s, Pakistan was ahead of India. China was having double-digit growth, and India was at the bottom. In 2000 to 2010, there is a marginal decline in India, and so in 2000 and to 2010, there's a marginal decline in India and China's growth rates, whereas Pakistan met with drastic decline at 4.7%. Some scholars hold the reform process introduced in 1988 in Pakistan and political instability as reasons behind this trend. We will study in a later section which sector contributed to this trend in these countries. So, first, look at how people engaged in different sectors contribute to GDP. It was pointed out in the previous section that China and Pakistan have more proportion of urban people than India. In China, due to topographic and climatic conditions, the area suitable for cultivation is relatively small, only about 10% of its total land area. The total cultivable land in China accounts for 40% of the cultivable area in India. Until the 1980s, more than 80% of people in China were dependent on farming as their sole source of livelihood. Since then, the government encouraged people to leave their fields and pursue other activities such as handicrafts, commerce, and transport. In 2008, with 40% of its workforce engaged in agriculture, its contribution to GDP in China is 10%. So let's see the table 10.3. So you see that in sectoral share of employment and GDP percentage 2008 to 2012. Sector agriculture, industry, and service. So let me just put it here. So in both India and Pakistan, what do you notice? The contribution of agriculture to GDP were how much? More. It was, say, India, it was 17 to say 20%, Pakistan. But the proportion of workforce, you're talking about workforce now, that works in this sector is more in India, 51% as compared to Pakistan, that is 45. All right. In Pakistan, about 45% of its people work in agriculture. Whereas in India, you see that it is how much? It is about 51%. The sectoral share of output and employment also shows that in all the three economies, the industry and service sector contribution. In China, it's more, and in China, it is more, as you say, 47%. But for India and Pakistan, it's a service sector. Like service sector in India, it's 57, and Pakistan, it's 54. And service sector, interestingly, they have less proportion of workforce, but their contribution is much more in terms of GDP. Okay. In China, the manufacturing contributes the highest to GDP at 47%, whereas in India and Pakistan, it is the service sector, look at this, service sector accounts for more than 50% of GDP here. All right. Now, in the normal course of development, countries first shift their employment and output from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. This is what is happening in China, as can be seen from table 10.4. The proportion of workforce engaged in manufacturing in India and Pakistan were low at 19 and 20% respectively. The contribution of industries to GDP is also just equal to or marginally higher than the output from agriculture. In India and Pakistan, the shift is taking place directly to the service sector. Isn't it interesting? Thus, in both India and Pakistan, the service sector is emerging as a major player of development. It contributes more to GDP and at the same time emerges as a prospective employer. If we look at the proportion of workforce in the 1980s, Pakistan was faster in shifting its workforce to service sector than India and China. It is opined that in the 1980s, India, China and Pakistan employed 17, 12 and 27% of its workforce in the service sector respectively. In 2008 and 12 here, it has reached the level of 27, 37 and 35% respectively. In the last 2 decades, the growth of agriculture sector, which employs the largest proportion of workforce in all the three countries, has declined. In the industrial sector, China has maintained a double-digit growth rate. Let's study this table, table 10.4. In this, it's written, in the last 2 decades, the growth rate of agriculture sector, which employs the largest proportion of workforce in the three countries, has declined. In the industrial sector, China has maintained a double digit, look at this, double digit, that is 10.8 growth rate, whereas India, now look at this, India and Pakistan growth rate has declined in that. That's what they're saying. In case of service sector, China has, if you see service sector, you find what China's sector has actually, China's growth is actually increased. It's been able to raise its rate of growth in 2008 to 10, whereas India and Pakistan, you see, they have stagnated with their service sector growth. Thus, China's growth is mainly contributed by the manufacturing sector and India's growth by service sector. During this period, Pakistan has shown deceleration in all the three sectors, if you see. Let's compare. 7.7 in industry 1980-90 and 6.8 in the service sector. To come to 2009 to 2012, here agriculture is in Pakistan 3.1, from 4 it's come down there, from 7.7 in industries come to 3.4, and service it's come to 4.0.